Well, good morning. You're all finding your seats. Those who have struggled through till the end. So I thought I'd show you a couple of the pictures from the dig that my wife's working on and my son's working on. That's my wife in the top right corner in the pink. She did actually finally get home last night after her getting stranded in Newark's airport, and her luggage was actually there at O'Hare waiting for her, and so everything worked out fine. So that's a little bit on the dig. You can see the kinds of situations they work in, and you can see that they're trying to uncover architecture. Archaeology is a lot more about architecture than artifacts. And by digging the architecture, they come to know how people lived in those towns in those times. And so that's a lot of what they do. So I thought I'd share that with you. Now I have to transition down to my PowerPoint here. So I will do that. And I want to extend. And there we go.
I like the background.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So for those of you who were in Sky Session earlier and have felt the desire to nurture a sense of boredom, I can only say you're welcome. I've had students who actually believe that's my spiritual gift, to enable them to experience boredom. And so at any rate, oh my, thank you for putting up with everything. I'm glad for anything I can do for your spiritual development. So today it's our last day, obviously, and talking about where do we go from here? We've learned about the ancient Near Eastern backdrop and the importance of touching base with that, trying to understand it as the best we can. We've learned about Torah and how Torah fits into that ancient Near Eastern background, but also transcends it. And we talked about that in connection to both lists of legal provisions as well as treaty stipulations. And so we tried to percolate out of that the important issues of wisdom and holiness and order. Okay? I'm hoping this is all sounding familiar to you. These are the things we've talked about all week. And then we talked about each of the individual words in the Decalogue. So we were just going down the funnel. Ancient Near East, Torah, Decalogue, each individual word. Hopefully that now puts us in a place to talk about what is its relevance to us. For some of you, this question's been swirling around since day one. If it's part of the ancient world, if it's situated in the ancient world, if it's situated in a covenant that's not our covenant, if it's situated in Israel's situation, living in the presence of God, how does this mean something to us? And of course, the church has a long history, not just the church, the Jewish folks as well have a long history of trying to work that out, wanting to respect Torah and Decalogue as scripture, but yet recognizing that that's not just a straightforward task. So we want to talk about some of the issues that drive this transformation as we think about what is the relevance of Torah and Decalogue to us. So we have some issues that we should have on the table that we want to be talking about. Here's one that I think is really maybe more significant than we often acknowledge. We like to be able to manage our obligations. to know what's expected of us, to conform to those expectations, whether an employer-employee situation, whether in your relations with your spouse, kids with their parents, students with their teachers. This idea of managing obligations. You know, I give out a syllabus every semester to every class, and one of the first things students do is they start making notes on their calendar of when things are due. Managing your obligations. Many of you have calendars at home, whether on your computer or hanging on the refrigerator, and you make a note of all the things that you're doing so that you can manage your obligations. And when we take a look at Torah and Decalogue, we put it into that grid. What is it that I'm supposed to do? And that's why we have a tendency to turn Torah and Decalogue into rules, into laws, into legislation. Because somehow we feel like if I can get everything on the proper list and then work at doing them, that I'll be managing my obligations. I'll be compliant in all the best ways to what's expected of me. Because especially people who want to be in relationship with God want to know, what does God expect of me? Remember, we encounter that pretty early in Micah 6:8, that famous verse. After Micah's been indicting the Israelites, well, what do you want from us? And Micah, remember, says it's pretty basic. Do justice. You know, basic things. And that drives so much of religious practice in religions all around the world. We've talked about it before. What do I need to do to be in favor with God? And that's not a bad thing to want to understand. What we've been talking about all week is that it's easy to turn that into a formula. Easy to make it reductionistic. And our faithfulness to God is not a formula. We've been talking about it all week that we want to turn it into a checklist. It's not a checklist. So we have to try to, now that we've tried to probe into Torah and Decalogue, we want to probe into this idea of, so how does this play into our understanding of how we need to think to please God? So let's put that one on the table. We really need to recognize that we all have this drive to manage our obligations. And sometimes the way that we do that is to try to create these lists of behavioral kinds of things that if we do those, everything will be good. What I've been trying to suggest about Torah and Decalogue is that they are less like a job description and more like a position description. Think about the chief financial officer of an organization, a business. Position description is the chief financial officer has oversight of all the financial operations of the company. Boom. Wow, what's that look like? So then you get the job description. And there's this and this and this and this and this and this. And for lots of people in lots of contexts, a job description is like a contract. I'm supposed to do all those things, and I'm only supposed to do only those things. Somebody will say, well, I need you to do this. That's not on my job description. Right? The job description, and we know it often doesn't work that way, but the job description is supposed to be precisely what you are asked to do. And so I'm trying to suggest that Torah and Decalogue are more like a position description. And it's moved a little bit toward a job description because it gives some examples instead of just, you're responsible for running the finances of the company. That has no illustrations. That's not aspective. Okay, you could give a couple examples and that would become an aspective list, but still not the same as a job description. So again, trying to change our perspective of what Torah and Decalogue are, even to Israel, let alone to us. Now, we've also been working down this funnel. We've heard from a couple different places this week, I don't know if I've used the term or not, but the 613 laws. The Pharisees of Jesus' time, as far as we know, had not yet come up with that equation. The earliest we see it, again, as far as I'm aware, and it's not my area of expertise, is in Maimonides, which is medieval period, where the 613 laws. So it doesn't go all the way back. Wasn't there at the time of Jesus, but still, already the Pharisees were trying to quantify everything. And again, turning it from Torah to legislation. But of course, they realized they had to expand it to do that. You could take those 613, whether you numbered them that way or not, but then you'd say, well, there's still a lot that doesn't cover. So now we have to try to expand that. And really, that was part of the Pharisees' job, to interpret exactly what the implications were. But they were thinking in terms of legal, legislative implications. And so again, had lost the concept of Torah as wisdom. Now, of the 613, of course, then we often narrow them down to the 10, the Decalogue. And somehow that Decalogue encompasses, but we know it doesn't. The Decalogue doesn't near encompass all that's involved in the 613. But then Jesus comes along and further down the funnel, 2. And he does say this encompasses the whole of Torah. But of course, the more you go down that funnel, the fewer and fewer details you have. The less and less it looks like a list. The more and more you have to figure it out yourself, what those implications are. And again, our desire to manage our obligation wants to reduce that sort of uncertainty of what all is involved. I want to know what's involved, so give me a list. But it just doesn't work that way. So we have to recognize that even through this funneling process, it becomes more and more nebulous exactly what we're supposed to do, and becomes more and more difficult to feel like we are managing our obligations. Now, of course, all of that opens up the question, in what way is Torah and Decalogue, in what way do they create obligation? Obligation is not just kind of a single thing. We encounter obligations in many different ways. Again, we could talk about obligations as they exist in law. The laws of our country, we're obliged to carry them out. That's an obligation. But it can be much more nebulous than that. I feel like I have an obligation to my family. To do what? To show up for Thanksgiving dinner or whatever. Okay? That's a different sort of obligation. I feel an obligation to my community, my neighborhood, to kind of keep my property presentable. Or maybe I feel an obligation to my neighbors to help them out. I see the newspaper on the driveway and I'll walk it up to their porch, or whatever. Obligation can work at many, many different levels, and some of them we impose on ourselves. But we still somehow try to get this list of what our obligations are. You could talk about your obligations to yourself. My obligation to myself is to try to eat reasonably. So when you think of obligation, recognize the multi-dimension nature of all of that. Now, as we move down from 6:13 to 10 to 2, as we think about obligation, we find out something very interesting. Less is more. When it's 6:13, you could make the mistake of thinking that it's comprehensive. And that's actually not a good way to think about it. Less is more. How is it more? When Jesus gets down to 2, that's less. How is it more? It's more because it broadens your perspective of the nature of your obligation. Because your obligation to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself is reduced every time you try to define it so you can manage your obligations. You decide, well, I can love my neighbors as myself by doing A, B, C, D, E. Boom. I've managed my obligations, and I'm going to do those 5 things faithfully, religiously. But then there's all the other things that you're not doing. And then you say, well, that becomes endless. And that's not something that should frustrate us. It's something that should inspire us to imagination. What are all the ways that I can love my neighbor as myself? What are all the ways that I can love the Lord my God? And don't dare stop at a list. Expansive, not reduced. So what is the nature of our obligation? Again, if it's not in terms of law, if we've gotten past that obstacle, it's not a matter of it being law. It's not a matter of being a list. And it's got all these qualifiers on it, ancient world, covenant. Then, again, this is the relevance question. What now is my obligation to Torah and Decalogue? That's our question to try to swing over the bridge here. So let's take a look at some of the ways that people have approached that as we start to try to work it out. Something's just popping into my head, and I'm trying to decide whether to say it now or wait and maybe forget it. Okay? I better say it now. I don't want to have a senior moment and forget it. Lots of us believe that the Torah, the Decalogue, the Bible as a whole, has a primary purpose to shape our morality. And therefore, when we ask a question, what is our obligation? We're trying to coax out of it a moral system. Because we would like our morality to be informed by the Bible. That's not a bad thing. But we have to recognize that that is not the Bible's principal intention. It is not the Decalogue's principal intention. It is not the Torah's principal intention. to deliver a moral system to us. That doesn't mean that morality isn't important, and it doesn't mean that morality is not informed by implications in the Torah. But we can't think that the Bible is there to construct a moral system. And I'm using system here to imply something that's somewhat complete, comprehensive, exhaustive, covers all the bases, dots the I's, crosses the T's, right? The Bible doesn't do that. So if your end goal is developing a moral system, you may find some help in the Bible, but the Bible's not going to do that for you, and was never intended to. Remember, if we are using the Bible for something it was not intended to do, we risk missing out on the authoritative message of what it was intending to do. If the author's intentions did not have to do with formulating a moral system, and we try to use it that way to the neglect of what the author was doing, go back to Monday, accountability problem, therefore authority problem. And we get in our mind that we've got this authoritative moral system that's from the Bible, but if that's not what the Bible's doing, then the only other option is it's something we're doing. And what we are doing does not have authority. That doesn't mean it can't be helpful. But again, we don't want to fool ourselves if we're not doing what the Bible is doing. So some of the things that we've done, we've sometimes used proof texts. And this actually happens a lot with the Torah, and to some extent with the Decalogue. Nobody really actually tries these days in the church to keep the whole Torah. Fringes on the garments, don't cut the side curls, make sure that the church picnic doesn't cook a kid in its mother's milk. I mean, we don't even try. We recognize all the rituals, we can't do those. So no one tries to keep all the Torah, so we recognize that all the Torah cannot possibly, in all of its parts, retain the same level of obligatory relevance to us. Yet, at our pleasure, we grab the verses we want. Ding, got it. Shoom. And then present it as, and here's the biblical view of XYZ. You can't do that. Your method has to be consistent or it's worthless. That was a strong statement. How do I back out? Really, if your method is not consistent, then all of the decisions, the choices are being made in your brain, not in the text, and therefore you're not getting that from the Bible, you're getting it from what you want to do. So we cannot mine the Torah for a proof text for this cause or this issue or that issue. Because if we're going to grab anything like that, we have to have some consistent method for what we grab and how. I want us to try to understand, I want myself to try to understand, what is the approach to Torah that's going to help me use it all consistently, to understand it all on the same lens, so that I'm not being subjective in just grabbing the things I want. Now, some of the ways that showed up. Oh, wow. Let me count the ways. Sometimes it's what I call imprecise cultural transfer. Tattoos. The Bible says you're not supposed to have tattoos. It does. Cultural question. What did tattoos mean then? What was communicated by tattoos then? Cultural river. Tattoos today are not the same thing, functioning the same way in society as they did then. And therefore, to get a tattoo today does not mean the same thing as getting a tattoo did then. And therefore, you can't just pull that across and say, the Bible says no tattoos. It's in a culture. It's situated. The tattoos in the ancient world aligned you with a god. They don't do that in ours. Some people might use them for that, but tattoos in general don't work that way. Sometimes another problem with the proof texting is the coincidence of wording. And we used this example when we did word 3, taking the Lord's name in vain. That's a coincidence of wording that we have picked up in our culture because of the Bible, the idea that if you're cussing or using profanity, you're taking the Lord's name in vain. That's just the description we've picked up because of the Bible. But again, we shouldn't be locked into that. Taking the Lord's name in vain is something far more significant than using the name of God in a profane statement. So sometimes when we're proof texting, we're grabbing a word or a phrase, but we're really giving it a very different meaning from what it had in context. Sometimes it's a matter of inadequate translation. Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 is just a fascinating example, but it's a fairly complicated one. It's the one section in the Torah that says anything about divorce and remarriage. What's interesting is that it sets up a very complicated scenario. So if a man takes a wife and then he finds something indecent in her, and even indecent, I would question whether that's hitting the nail on the head, but he finds something of a negative sort, right? And if, we're still going with the ifs, if he writes her a writ of divorce, and if he sends her away, and if she marries somebody else, and if, you can see how complicated this is, and if that somebody else either dies or divorces her or whatever, then you say, oh great, now finally 4 verses later I'm getting to then. Then that husband cannot take that woman again. She's free, whether by divorce or death of her husband. That first husband cannot marry her again. And most translations say something like, because she has defiled herself. And that's opened up all kinds of discussions about divorce defiling, remarriage defiling, because she's defiled. We have totally missed the nature of that verb. There's a very simple way that the Hebrew could have said, because she has defiled herself, and it doesn't say it. It's a very complex and rare verb form that says, because she has been made to consider herself to be defiled. Yeah, that's all in one verb form. She has been made to consider or declare herself to be defiled. So what's happened here? When that first husband sent her away, that something indecent, that cannot include sinful things like adultery. Again, there's another way for the text to say that. This is something more general, and it has to do with something that is just inappropriate. It's probably, I'm guessing, there's only one possibility, It's probably like the woman who had the flow for 38 years and touched Jesus' garment and was healed. Anyone who had that medical condition, a woman in that medical condition, could never have children, could never have sexual relations, because she was constantly experiencing the bleeding. And her life was done. So one possibility in Deuteronomy 24, the husband has discovered that his wife has a similar sort of condition. So she can never give him children. Not because she's incapable of having children, but because of this medical condition. Within an Israelite culture, he would be perfectly within his rights to dismiss her, to send her away. But that would have made her condition a public matter. He has caused her to either declare, it's been made public, or to consider herself, even what she thinks about herself, to be defiled. It's not her fault. And the prohibition is not on her. It's on him. He's not allowed to marry her. Not she's not allowed to get married to anybody else. He's not allowed to take her as a wife again. Why would he do that? Well, he's in major control of her life because of the situation he's put her in. Furthermore, for all we know, she has an inheritance from the second marriage. Who knows? It doesn't matter. You can see that's a very complicated passage, and it turns on the translation of that particular word, which is a very complicated Hebrew verbal form. But it changes everything. So churches trying to make position papers on divorce and remarriage, when they pull this verse as a proof text and build their whole policy on a mistranslation of it, not recognizing either the linguistic or the cultural backgrounds, things get messy. You end up with a position statement that's supposedly biblical and doesn't represent the biblical text at all. So there are problems with mining the Torah for proof texts. And these are just 3 of the possibilities. Another issue, of course, is how then do we think about the theology undergirding the Torah and the Decalogue? Again, it's not a theology of legislation. Okay, and so we're going back to the things we talked about earlier this week. It's not a theology founded in legislation as a means to manage your obligations, but it's rather founded in wisdom for establishing order to give honor to Yahweh's name. How do we give honor to Yahweh's name? Well, we could sit here all day, all week, all month, listing ways. And again, it's one of those things that it's open-ended, innumerable ways. Be creative. At each moment in your life, am I honoring God in what I'm doing? Going through life with Jesus. And Sky's been talking a lot about that this week. That communion, living in communion with Jesus. And saying, what should I do as a wise person? We had a kid's book when our kids were growing up. And it was about turtle. And the turtle was trying to figure out how he should conduct himself. Should he be inside his shell or outside his shell? He said, well, I think I'm just going to be outside the shell. That's how I'll manage my obligation. I'll reduce it. I should be outside my shell. And so he's outside his shell. Well, next thing you know, a predator comes along. and he nearly gets eaten up and whoom, pulls into the shell. Says, okay, that didn't work so well. He said, so I should stay in my shell all the time. That's what a wise turtle would do. Stay in my shell all the time. After a while, he got hungry. And he figured out that wasn't really very wise to do that. And the end of the book, you can imagine, was basically a wise turtle would know when to go in the shell and when to stay out of the shell. That's what a wise turtle would do. So, what should a wise Christian do? You know, it's not all one or all the other. As wise Christians, we should be living in communion with our God and living within that mentality of our decisions, of our actions. Always asking, what would a wise turtle do? What would a wise Christian do? And it's not like you'll always have a straightforward, immediate answer. Sometimes you won't know, because it's not always straightforward. So the underlying theology that I've been suggesting has to do with wisdom, establishing order, exalting Yahweh's reputation, honoring his name. Now, some people wanting to try to make good use of Torah and Decalogue say, okay, so what we need to do is look at each of these and derive principles from them. It's a very common way to do it. So we'll look at this, building a parapet on your roof. Okay, so we're not going to look at that as a law per se, but let's derive a principle from it, that we have some responsibility for the safety of people that come onto our property. And we should not only consider ourselves liable, and therefore we have to be careful, but also just for the health and welfare, right? Deriving a principle from this law about building a parapet on your roof. I confess that for decades, that was pretty much what I taught. When I taught about the Old Testament and got into Torah, a derived principles approach. And my son and I were writing this book together, the Torah book. And he said, Dad, you can't do that. I said, of course I can. I've been doing it for decades. He says, no. He says, that won't work. You can't do this principles thing. I said, okay, why not? Try to be teachable. Why not? Why can't I do this? He said, because, number one, you can't do it consistently. Ouch. You can't do it consistently. You can't make a principle out of every one of those. And even when you are, and even when it looks pretty easy, like the parapet on the roof, I mean, that's a real softball. Okay, even when it looks easy, you're making up the principle. And it's rarely going to be certain that that's actually a principle that's behind it. You're just making something up that sounds reasonable. And that means it's reasonable to you, and that means it's subjective, and that means it's not the author's authority, it's yours. Do I have to write to all my students again and tell them I was going the wrong direction? Anyway, and he persuaded me by force of logic that even though we may feel like we can derive some very useful, helpful, important principles, if we can't do it consistently, and we're making those principles up out of the store of our knowledge of what we think is reasonable, that's not the Bible speaking anymore. It's using the Bible to do what we want it to do anyway. And Christians have always done that pretty well. Using the Bible to get to something that they wanted to do anyway. and not particularly paying much attention if it was something that they didn't want to do. The importance of consistency in your methodology. That one slipped by my radar for decades. I didn't know I was doing it. I didn't realize the flaw. I was trying to figure out what to do with Torah. And it took somebody else, my son, bringing a different perspective. When he said, "Dad, you can't do that," I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Dad, you taught me hermeneutics. That's methodology. You taught me hermeneutics since I was a little kid. I learned hermeneutics. It's your hermeneutics. And your hermeneutics will not get you there." Inconsistency. We all do it, and it's hard to catch ourselves. So, I would argue that no, even though we may be able to derive some useful principles, that's not what the text is doing. Whenever we're doing something that the text isn't doing, we have to get the red flags up. I go the same way with narratives. We can use biblical narratives for role models. Mine the stories of the Old Testament for role models. But that's not what those are doing. And they could make some pretty decent role models, but that's not what they're doing. The stories are not in the Bible to provide us with role models, although some of them do anyway, but that's not what they're doing. Occasionally, they're trying to do it. That's great, we better recognize that. But again, the assumptions about what is it the text is doing. Again, that whole idea with Old Testament Bible stories, well, all Bible stories, narratives, and what they're doing and what not they're doing, that's the basic focus of that book that I mentioned earlier this week, the Bible Story Handbook, where we go through 175 stories and say, what are they doing? And why it's usually not role models or behavioral objectives. So, are they principles? My answer is no. That doesn't get us to what the Bible is doing. So we have to ask the question, where then is the revelation and the uniqueness? And of course, you've heard me say it all week, it's not in the legal sayings. The legal sayings are the same kinds of things you find in the ancient Near Eastern material. Nothing unique about those. Nothing that you can say, oh, here's the revelatory nature of it. So what is the uniqueness? Remember, I think it was the first day. We were all sitting at the base of Mount Sinai, right? Voice booms, you shall not kill. And so that's not new. So the uniqueness is not in the provisions themselves or in stipulations themselves. What is unique? And when we find what's unique and what could stand as revelation, then we're on our way to tracking with what we're supposed to do with them. Okay, so first of all, they are embedded in covenant. Remember, recontexted. And recontexted into a covenant between God and Israel, a suzerain and vassal, a God taking a people for himself. Never happened anywhere else. And the Bible tells us that that's the case. So it's not that these are just sayings, don't murder. It's that they've been embedded in a covenant that has a broader and more important purpose. The idea that they're also helping Israel to know how to live in sacred space. And we've talked about that. And the idea of the holiness of Yahweh's reputation. These are the things that are unique. So it's not just that you shouldn't murder. It's that, like everybody else in the ancient world, you shouldn't be committing murder. And that doesn't have to do just with the morality of it. It has to do with you are my holy people, and you are reflecting my name and reputation. And therefore, you don't act this way because that is how my reputation, my name is going to be honored among you. So it doesn't let you stop at the act itself. It makes you think about, how does this fit into the larger picture of God and his people, living wisely, reflecting holiness. Think the big picture. So we have to move beyond the specifics to see the larger context. So this leads us to certain trajectories. We can't talk about the Torah as simply works of the law. That's a New Testament discussion. It's an important one that really doesn't have much to do at all with the Old Testament and its discussion. In Paul's conversations, the idea of whether the works of the law can bring salvation was important, but that wasn't an Old Testament conversation. We have trajectories for social issues today, and we've got plenty of them, and they're important to us, and they should be. And we do want to be able to work things out in ways that will reflect honor to God. But again, we recognize that the Bible's focus, the Torah's focus, is not to answer all the social issues that we have today. So, we're not supposed to be talking about works of the law when we're doing Torah. We're not supposed to be talking about our modern social issues. We have to get there. But we have to understand Torah and Decalogue first before we start getting there. Because we want to know what the truth claims of Torah are in its own intentions. So we can't formulate according to the New Testament issue. We can't formulate in accordance with our modern social issues. We can't formulate in terms of moral theology. Moral theology is important. But again, the Bible is not doing moral theology. It certainly provides information that has implications for our moral theology. But as I've said, it doesn't provide a moral system. So we are well within appropriate desires to say we want to really have a strong morality. But we have to do things that move outside of the pages of Scripture in order to do that. And remember, Scripture's goal is not to give us a moral system. We are a new covenant community, and we have to try to figure out what that entails. It's interesting, Jesus talks about, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Somebody mentioned that earlier in the week, one of the speakers or something. And I hope that your ears perked up. If you love me, you will keep my, he used the C word, the commandments. And if that kind of popped up on your radar, your mental radar, I hope you asked the next question. What were Jesus' commandments? When did he give something that we could call commandments? Well, certainly he commanded the apostles, go wait until the Comforter comes. But that's not the same kind of thing we're talking about here. You could say, well, the Great Commission. But the list would be pretty sparse. And even there, we ask the question of, there's something bigger going on here. If we are trying to manage our obligations in line with Christ's teaching, it's only going to cover certain fairly narrow aspects. And the rest we're going to have to work out. So, let's talk about sorting it all out. Here's where I can make everyone angry. Or maybe just frustrated, you know. I would like to propose that our morality, our integrity, those kinds of things are shaped by a combination of 5 factors. Is there an absolute morality? I'm most comfortable thinking that there is. But what's our morality founded in? If it's not delivered wholesale by Scripture, some people would say, well, it's embedded in the character of God. Sounds logical. How much do we really know of the character of God? We know what He's revealed, but we also know His ways are not our ways, and His thoughts are not our thoughts. So let's say for a moment that there is an absolute morality. How do we get to it? It's all well and good to say there is one, if there's no pathway for us to get to it. But of course, most of us are pretty uncomfortable with saying, okay, well, if there's not an absolute morality, then there's a relative morality. Ooh, that's bad. That's really bad. We don't want morality to just kind of be a subjective thing, what everybody thinks is right. But of course, those are 2 extreme points on either end of the spectrum. Let's think about how we actually do this thinking about morality and integrity. If Torah and Decalogue are not fundamental, foundational documents for that, but yet may have implications for that, how does this all work? And so I think about, and there may be more, and maybe some of you have more ideas to add to this, but I think about 5 factors. The first factor that I would identify is general community standards. Now, I say that's the low bar because, of course, now we're talking about non-Christians as well as Christians. Community standards. As I was thinking about this, it probably is not so much the community standards regarding things that they allow and tolerate. You know, our culture today tolerates a fairly high level of promiscuity. And that's not the kind of thing we'd say, oh, well, since the culture around us allows that, we should allow that too. No. We're not following the trends of libertarian thinking just because the culture around us does. But turn that coin around to the other side of it. The things that the culture around us finds abhorrent, despicable, despisable behavior, those are things we ought to think about a little more. So, for example, Proverbs says pretty clearly, beat a child with a rod and then you'll turn out with a good disciplined child. Whoa. The Bible told me that I have to beat my kid with a rod. No, it doesn't. Remember, that's Proverbs. It's dealing with wisdom in that culture where that was perfectly acceptable. We would look in our culture and say, no. There we're going to follow the lead of culture and say, as we shape our morality and integrity, and more so as we try to reflect God's honor in ourselves as a light to the people around us, we're going to be really careful there. We're not going to insist on beating our kids with sticks. We've learned other sensibilities. Not everybody puts a lot of stock in political correctness, but we can talk about how we as Christians need to perhaps conform a little bit, in some ways at least, to some of those expectations, just so that we don't bring dishonor to God's name as we choose a countercultural path. "50 years ago, it would not have been considered a moral flaw to use the N-word. Today it is. Step up." You know, we are prompted by some of the things in culture around us. That's one element that lends shape. A second one is conscience. Different people have their conscience attuned on different wavelengths. I certainly found that as I was raising my kids. Things that I had a pretty strong conscience about, they didn't. And it wasn't because their conscience was immature or ill-formed, it's just they weren't running on the same cylinders as I was. I believe that as we find shape for our morality and integrity, that conscience is a piece of that puzzle. But here's the trick on this one. Conscience should not easily become something we enforce on somebody else. To use my conscience and to say everyone else is responsible for living within the... No, that shouldn't work. You might try to persuade people, but I've spent many years, year after year, in my classes, occasionally trying to make a case to students that there is such a thing as modesty, and therefore we ought to be thinking about it and having an attuned conscience for that. It's not an easy sell to the college audience today. So we can try to persuade others on the power of conscience, but that's maybe not the direction we ought to be going. So we have the community at large. We've got our own individual conscience, which hopefully is constantly being attuned, sharpened. And of course, this is the one we spent most time on this week. The sense of biblical wisdom. You can see now that I'm not trying to frame this in terms of the commands or the laws, but if Torah and Proverbs and the Sermon on the Mount and the fruit of the Spirit are all part of this aspective picture, then those have implications as we try to develop wisdom. In the end, our morality is going to need to be shaped by wisdom in any of these categories. Fourthly, we always have to have that bigger picture in mind. Even if we feel like we are complying to our sense of management of our obligations, we know that honoring God's name does not stop with our list of obligations. So we still have to be asking those additional questions. What pleases and honors God? So, you might say, the world around me has no trouble with R-rated movies, so there's no drawback there. And maybe you say, and my conscience really doesn't bother me to watch R-rated movies. And, well, there's nothing in the Bible about R-rated movies. Oh, wait, there's there's nothing in the Bible about R-rated movies. And so I've gone through my checklist, and now it's okay. If my conscience is okay, and if there's no proof text from the Bible and the larger community says it's okay, well then, I should be able to do that. Well, no, we've got still another criteria here. Is this really something that I feel like I'm honoring God when I'm doing it? And you can talk about, well, it's R-rated because of this, or it's R-rated because of that, or whatever. Okay, but is what I'm doing honoring God? Sitting down watching the TV, watching your R-rated movie. Ding dong, open the door. Oh, hey, Jesus. Yeah, come on in and watch this movie with me. Uncomfortable, perhaps. So sometimes our consciences can be giving us plenty of freedom. But we still have this bigger picture. What does wisdom look like? What does holiness look like? Now there's one more criterion here. The wisdom of the body of Christ. We're in community. We all have our blind spots. We all have our flaws. We all have those places where we give our conscience a pass. And that's why we need community. And whether it's on individual behaviors or whether it's on social issues or whatever it might be, we're supposed to really function as a community. Well, that doesn't mean that all of these issues will be immediately solved by a vote of the church board. I'm not really suggesting that. But remember, even something like the nature of Jesus as God-man took the church about 300 years to figure out, to get nailed down. And we shouldn't expect all of our issues to be resolved quickly. But we should try to deal with them as community. And then when we work as community, probably it'd be very unusual if there was even one person here who didn't ever find themselves disagreeing with some decision that the church leadership made. It's not easy as people who have our own flaws and fallenness, leaders as well as lay people, and to try to work through these. Now, please, please, please notice, I have not presented any one of these 5 as self-standing. They are all factors, but none of them can stand alone. But they're all factors, and they all have implications. We do want to try to make progress on a moral identity. We do want to try to make progress on sorting out very difficult social issues. We do want to make progress on those things. And again, where the Torah comes into this is not as a proof text, but as providing doors and prompts for wise thinking. Wise thinking in an Israelite context would not have necessarily led to the same conclusions as wise thinking will do for us. And that doesn't mean that they're wrong or that we're wrong. Cultures change. And that's not because morality is relative, it's because morality is complicated. So all 5 of these, and like I said, maybe there are more that I've missed. That's just the list I came up with. But I'm trying to address the question of how the biblical text can retain the relevance that it inherently has as we work through our processes. So none of those provide absolute certainty. They all have to work together. None provide absolute certainty, none give us a list. If there's one thing you take out of this week's lessons about the Torah, I hope it's the red letters here. Abandon the list. Start thinking differently about how we manage our obligations. Now, some of you, most of you, have probably sat there saying, well, that's unsatisfying. It doesn't get me to a confident bottom line. You're right. Welcome to life. How can we achieve some sort of confidence going forward? We use all 5 of these. It at least gives us something to move forward with. Well, how do I know how to rank those? You don't. We're the body of Christ. We're God's people. We're supposed to work together on these things. It's another place where our individualism is just taking us out at the knees. Because we all think I can make this decision all by myself. These aren't decisions that are supposed to be made all by yourself. And to regain that sense of a community, working together, not just to feed the poor, that's really important, and not just to provide clothing for the clothes pantry. I mean, great things. But we have to find ways to work together to think about how we can honor God as his people, chosen by him in covenant relationship, given the status of holiness, living in wisdom. And when we look at Torah, we say, this is how God led them in wisdom and holiness. We're not the same as them. But let me look at that and how that wisdom and holiness was working out with them. And I'm not going to derive principles from it, but I'm going to try to take some prompts. Let me look at the scope of holiness. It didn't just involve your daily prayer times. The scope of holiness for Israel was vast. It affected every aspect of their lives. How did God ask them to be wise about their relationship with him? How can that help us to think about being wise in our relationship with him? I told you that it was my son who kind of drove me off that word principles. And I've started trying to think more about the word values. I think it's better, though I suspect that he wouldn't like that one either. He'd come up with something. He's a very interesting conversation partner. But I think that's at least moving in the right direction, because values is something that now you're thinking, again, wisdom and the value of being God's holy people, the value of God's name being honored. So I don't mean values like I should be honest. Well, you should. That's a great value. But I'm, again, thinking in the larger sphere. I hope you can see very clearly that I'm still working this out for myself. And I'm sure I'm still making mistakes. But we have to keep working at it. So we certainly want to abandon the list. That can help us to think in broader terms. So to summarize, for Israel, Torah offers Israel a motorcycle. No. Torah offers Israel wisdom to guide them, not oblige them. wisdom to guide them in forging an identity that correlates with the holy status they were given when they were designated the people of God. Now, those of you who have been paying attention all week know this is not the first time you've seen that slide. But we need to keep being reminded. So let's go to the next step. That's what it does for Israel. Okay, so how about for us? Torah offers us wisdom. Oh, that's the same. Offers them wisdom, also us, to understand the scope and range of holiness. Israel is an example of the scope and range of holiness. And again, our scope and range is not going to look exactly the same. The scope and range of holiness to guide us in, well, this looks the same, forging an identity. That's what we're doing, whether you call it morality or integrity or whatever it might be. We're forging an identity. And that identity is supposed to reflect the holy status that we have been given as the people of God. Our goal is not to manage our obligations and decide what's obligatory in the Torah and what's not. The goal is to enhance our wisdom. And wisdom cannot be reduced to obligations. Okay, we've got some time. I intentionally wanted to leave time for some questions. We've got about 15 minutes. So let's talk. And if I say, I don't know, yes, speak up.
Would another prompt rather than principle be Council of Jerusalem in the book of Acts? Paul took this and applied it to the law, applied law to his circumstances. The church in the book of Acts applied that to their circumstances with the Gentiles. What do we do with these people and their morality, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, again, the Council of Jerusalem was trying to come up with how to solve a particular problem. And you could see that they brought a number of different factors into play. The world around them, and the wisdom of the community, and the illustrations drawn from text. So they were doing the same kind of thing. So I think that we can see an illustration of that practice, right? And you know, I would actually contend that this is how we've always done this. I mean, the fact that we've been very selective about what we pull as proof texts from the Bible suggests we've always done this. We've always used those 5 things, even if we didn't know we were doing that, right? It's just how we've always made these decisions. Yes, sir.
So when Jesus said, no longer will he teach, let them know the Lord, just go write it on. Where does that fit in on the 5 books?
Okay, so the question was about the writing of the law on the heart, right? And again, to some extent, that fits in with the idea of conscience, but I don't think it's particularly specifically getting at conscience. So for that, I have to go back to Jeremiah 31, which is where that first came out. It's referred to in the New Testament, but is first expressed in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 33, the New Covenant. And there, the idea of Torah written on the heart. But remember, once we understand that Torah is not law, but is wisdom, then the idea of wisdom being written on the heart becomes a different matter. It's not only wisdom, but of course it's revelation. Now Jeremiah, unbeknownst to most of us modern people, Jeremiah is actually using subtly an analogy to something that happened in the rest of the ancient world. When the Babylonians, let's use them, they were at the time of Jeremiah, when the Babylonians wanted to get some information from God, they would bring an animal into the presence of the image. A priest was helping them with all of this. Usually it was the king and the priest bringing this animal in, and they'd slaughter the animal, and they'd prepare a meal from the meat, and they would feed the god, hoping to put him in a good mood, fat and happy, and ready to answer their question, give a favorable answer. But how would they get that answer? After all, the image is not going to speak. Well, what they would do is, after the animal was sacrificed and the meal prepared, then the entrails of the animal would be removed, and this is a process called extispicy, and the diviner priest would examine the entrails of the animal. Now, as they did that, their ritual prayer to the god was that he should write his answer on the entrails. I'm using entrails broadly here. It is the liver, the kidney, the heart, the stomach, the intestines. Okay, that the god would write the answer on those entrails. And that therefore revelation would come as the god wrote on, for instance, the heart. Isn't that cool? So Jeremiah is sort of touching base with this practice. And the idea is that guidance, revelation, wisdom for making decisions, God is going to communicate into the heart of his people in this new covenant. So that's sort of what it's getting at. But again, it's certainly not a matter of law being written on your heart. Right? Yes, sir.
One of the things that I think has been a little bit of a revelation for me, there are some people who believe that the sin against the Holy Spirit simply is the sin against the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments were given to Moses. He didn't tell him to write them down. He etched them in stone. And not only did he etch them in stone, they carried them with them, and they put them in the Holy of Holies in the temple. Well, what does that tell you? That tells you that those Ten Commandments are the foundation of all principles that are godlike. They should be placed in every public place. They should be placed in every school as a reminder who put them there. And that's what we look at to form the foundation of laws in any generation. They are true today as they were true then. And I think the people of this nation, and I'm talking about the United States, have somewhat overlooked them. That's the start of it all. It never goes away. We can talk about all kinds of ways we should interpret things, which you've addressed. But still the basis is that.
So the question it concerns the Ten Commandments as a foundation, as a basis. And again, I would both agree and pause to maybe disagree just a bit. I'm sorry. If the Decalogue is trying to give some sense of some core values in Torah, and you could make that case, although there's an awful lot of Torah that's not represented there. I don't think that the Decalogue was meant to fully represent all of the Torah. Jesus, too, was doing that, and he says so. But the Decalogue is sort of like a mini Torah, but it's not a summary of them all. But I agree with you that we neglect the Decalogue to our shame and to our damage. But I don't want to promote the idea that if you've got the Decalogue, you've got it all. Because again, the Decalogue itself is prompts to larger conversations. That's how Jesus used it. So, yes, sir. Well, again, I don't think that Jesus' 2 is a replacement for the Decalogue. I don't think that the New Covenant somehow nullifies what we learned from the Torah and from the covenant with Israel. So to that extent, I wouldn't say that we can now neglect the Old Testament because we have the New Testament. I spent my life doing Old Testament, so that's clearly not my position. Yes, sir.
Part of that is he did not come to do away with the law. He came to fulfill the law.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different aspect of that. But my question for you is, when they refer to law, is that a translation situation with us, putting our interpretation of law as we see it on that? Or is the law in the Torah or in the Hebrew more referring to like a law of the universe, similar to their certain universal laws that are constants, but not necessarily known until we investigate and understand them better?
Okay, so the question is about the nature of our terminology. Again, as I've tried to express, Torah has to do with instruction. So it's not the laws of nature, it's not the laws of the universe, it's not natural law, it's not any of those things. Torah is instruction, and so we need to read it in that light. When Jesus says that he has not come to do away with well, of course, in the New Testament we have the Greek word nomos, but to fulfill. And we have to assume that for his Jewish audience, he is using that Greek word to translate the term Torah. Now, of course, there's a good argument that can be made that Jesus spoke Aramaic, and Torah is also used as an Aramaic word. And so again, we get all of this, but certainly nomos, the Greek word in the New Testament, is not the exact equivalent of Torah in the Old Testament. Just like law is not a good English equivalent, nomos is not necessarily a great Greek equivalent. But yet, again, since he's talking to a Jewish audience, we can superimpose the word Torah on that rough equivalent in Greek or Aramaic and still talk about what Jesus is saying. So again, he's not overthrowing Torah. Of course not. With all the things we've said that Torah is, Jesus would not want to overthrow that. He is certainly going to call into question what the Pharisees do with Torah, but that's a different thing altogether. Okay? And when he says that he has come to fulfill Torah, what does that mean? How does Jesus fulfill Torah? Well, again, not through legislation, not through commands. He fulfills Torah because Torah was helping God's people have a sense of how to live wisely, reflecting holiness, honoring God's name. That's exactly what Jesus is doing. So Torah is fulfilled in him as the one who does those things. Wisdom, holiness, order, honoring God's name. Yes? That one? Or the one before? We got a couple more minutes if there are any lingering questions. Yes, sir.
Sorry to verbose, but another example of a cultural expectation you were talking about, what does our culture expect so we don't beat our children with a rod today? Would a positive example be that we all agree our kids should get an education at least complete high school? We agree with the culture on that, so that's an expectation for our country.
So you're using that children being educated as an example of how we are conforming to cultural expectations. Yeah. again, we often find that the things that culture is moving towards sometimes are good things, and that we want to be following that same road. Well, thank you all very much for your attention and for your attendance and for your questions, and also just for the kind words that many of you have said to me on the side here and there. I really appreciate the encouragement, and I'm going to keep working on this stuff, and I hope you do too. There's still maybe a couple books in the back left if I'm getting ready to pack them up because I'm heading for home after lunch. So, but if somebody still needs to pick up a copy, you can go do that. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day.
Just an observation. I appreciated your saying that, isn't this the way we've really done this historically?